Hello everyone, my name is Ken, and the purpose of this video is to remind myself about the death system that I just completed for my game. So let's get into it. You're actually seeing the screen now. Not a whole lot going on here, but let me do a quick demo, show you how it works. So with most games, once you hit 0 health, you die. So this is no different. We're losing our hunger very quickly, so that's going to start affecting our health. And so once we hit 0, we are no longer alive. And you can see we have this nice vignette fade. We have a button to respawn, which is currently disabled until this timer hits 0. So when I hit the respawn button, we're just going to get respawned into the game as a dead ragdoll. But I'm going to clean that up later. For now, I was just focused on the actual death cycle itself, which you just saw. So let's get into how I set this up. Let me reset these values because I don't want to forget. And file save, compile save. The first thing to show is probably how I created that effect. So in UI materials, I created a new material called tunnel vignette. And the way this material works is if I create this 1 minus node, plug that into the final, see we have this white screen. But if I bring the radius down to 0.4, oops, you see it gets smaller. If I go 0.3, it keeps getting smaller and smaller. So that's the effect, the foundation of the effect at least. There's also a hardness, there's a hardness value too, which controls how soft or hard you want the fade to be. Yeah, so what we do is we plug this into the opacity, and then we create a black background, and that allows us to create an animation which creates that effect. And I'll show that in a second. So we create a material instance off that material, which allows us to expose those two parameters. You won't actually be able to see it working here because, well, it is working, but there's a black background, so you don't actually see anything. So if I close these and we go into the UI and blueprints, we have a new depth folder. Now we have a new depth screen. And this is that screen you saw earlier. So it's just you are dead text with a button. And there's also an image, but this image is taking up the whole canvas. And the image set is that material instance that I showed earlier. So that's kind of cool. I didn't know you could do that till recently. So this material instance is plugged into this image slot. And then what you can do with that is if you go into the animations tab, you can create a new animation. I created one here called tunnel close. You can select your image, and then you can select your track, which could be the brush and the two parameters that we exposed in that material. And that allows you to key those values. And so I keyed those values here at 0.5. And then as we scroll through the timeline, we get that effect. And over here, it's set to 0.5 and 0. Yeah, 0.05, negative 0.05. So that's how we create that vignette effect. So, and that just gets played in code when you die. Speaking of code, let's show what we did here. So it's probably best to start at the ability systems attribute set because this is where we check the player's health. So it's going to be this one. So anytime we set the player's health, what we do is we clamp the health and then we check whether or not it's 0 or below. And then if it is, we run this function called handle 0 health. And what this is going to do, it's going to get our actor. It's going to grab the death component that is attached to the actor. All players now have a death component. It'll check if we're dead. It'll check if something killed us. And if it did, it'll pass that controller along to the death component. So there's this entry point here called start death. So this is kind of the heart of the system. So that is here in components. So if we go into start death, this is a very small component. There is a start death that checks whether or not we're the server, that we're not already dead, and then it will run a broadcast. There's also an on rep for the client, which I'll be using later. So we're broadcasting the event, the death event, to anyone that wants to listen, and the responsibility of the death controller kind of ends there. It's the responsibility of the listeners to do something about that event if they want. And so the two places that are interested in that event is the player character and the player controller. So let's start with the player character. So the player character has a new function here called handle death. So all the player controllers now have a death component, and then it's subscribing to that event. And when that event is triggered, we run this function here. So if I go into here, this is where we're subscribing to that event. Whoops. What did I just do? Let's go back. There we go. Oh, I just did a breakpoint. So we're subscribing to the event here, and then we're running this handle death function, which is doing some basic things right now. Disable movement, disable collision, do the ragdoll, which is not going to be a long-term thing. Ragdolls kind of suck, but it's enough to get the feature going. And then I was unpossessing the controller, but I actually wanted the player to be able to move their head around while they're in that vignette effect. So they have a few seconds to see like what killed them maybe. So that is what's going on in the player character. In the player controller, let's go there. So the player controller has a handle pawn death, so it's also listening to the on death broadcast. So when the player is possessed, we have a valid pawn. We check whether or not that pawn has a death component, and then we subscribe to that broadcast here as well. And the only thing this is doing is we have a widget set on the blueprint. And then if it is set, we create it, we add it to the viewport, we allow mouse cursor to be used, and then we find that animation that we created, which I called anim tunnel close. And then we play that animation here. So as soon as the player dies, the player controller will attach that widget to the screen, and then it plays that animation. And when the user clicks the button to respawn, this is what gets triggered here. This will get cleaned up later. This is not actually doing anything, spectacular yet. The other thing to show, or the last thing to show really, is the widget code. So in UI widget death, we have a new death screen. This is another very simple class. So there's the respawn button, and then there's the countdown text, and all that, and then there's the timer itself, which is set to 15 seconds for now. And what we're doing is, if we have a button, we just disable it, and then we subscribe to the click. So if the user clicks it, we want to run this function, and then we have a countdown and a timer that we trigger. And so this is what counts down the respawn, and then when it's available, we enable it. And then when the user clicks the button, this is where we ask the player controller to respawn the player and then remove that death screen. So that's kind of the end to end. There's a lot more to do and a lot more to refine, but this is kind of the core system that we got working. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.